I'm Jessica Nielsen, and I'm the Conservation Specialist at Coal Oil Point Reserve. And I want to thank Channel Islands Restoration for having us here tonight. I appreciate you hosting us. And I'm here with my colleague, Kipp Callahan, who also works at the reserve as the Land and Resource Steward. And to start us off tonight, I'll give you an overview of our conservation program for the Western Snowy Plover, which is a threatened species of shorebird that has now nested successfully at the reserve for over 20 years. And about halfway through, Kipp Callahan will take over to discuss habitat restoration at the reserve. So before I begin, I wanted to give you some background on the reserve where Kipp and I work. Coal Oil Point Reserve is part of a larger network of reserves called the University of California Natural Reserve System. And this is a network of 41 reserves throughout the state that are owned and managed by different UC campuses. So for example, UCSB manages 7 of those reserves. And these reserves were established to protect important natural environments in order to support research, university level education, and public service. And if you've had a chance to visit any of these reserves that you see on the map, you probably have a good idea of just how special these places really are, all of these protected areas. So this is an aerial view of Coal Oil Point Reserve. It's located just a few miles from UC Santa Barbara's main campus, and it encompasses 170 acres of a variety of different protected habitats, including a seasonal estuary called Devereaux Slough, vernal pools, grasslands, sandy beach, and a coastal dune ecosystem. And these diverse habitats provide a home to more than 1,000 species that have been observed within the boundaries. We have 3 full-time staff. Kipp Callahan, who will be speaking tonight, is our Land and Resource Steward. He's an excellent botanist, and among many other things, he manages the habitat restoration projects at the reserve. Dr. Chris Sandoval has been the reserve director for over 20 years, and so later on when I talk about the start of the Plover program here, Chris was the director at the time, so she was instrumental in starting this program, and she's continued to make it a priority. In addition to our on-site staff, we have an amazing team of volunteers and interns. We typically have about 50 at any given point in the year. And we absolutely could not run our programs without the help of these volunteers and interns. So we're super thankful for their dedication and all that they do for the reserve. And as for me, I am the conservation specialist. And so my main role is to manage the conservation programs at the reserve. The reserve is home to several different threatened, endangered, and sensitive species, such as Belding savanna sparrow and tidewater goby. But tonight I'll focus mostly on our conservation efforts with the snowy plover. And this is the bird that you see on the photo in the bottom left here. Western snowy plovers are a species of shorebird that are federally protected under the Endangered Species Act due to a range of factors, mostly habitat loss, human disturbance, inclement weather, and predation. These plovers are very small shorebirds. They're only about the size of a tennis ball when they're adults, so you can imagine how small they are when they're still chicks. And they can be identified by their snowy white chest and underbelly. They have a sandy colored back and a black bill and grayish blackish legs. They also have dark markings on their forehead, their shoulders, and behind their eyes. And these dark markings are very prominent in the male adults in the breeding season, but they can be quite indistinct in juveniles, some females, and also when it's not breeding season, those dark markings start to fade away. These birds have excellent camouflage, so if you're not actively looking for them, it's not uncommon to be walking along the beach and not even notice them until they start scurrying away from you in the sand. The range of the Pacific Coast population of snowy plover extends from southern Washington all the way down to Baja. Part of the reason they're threatened is that plovers are very habitat specific, and their habitat happens to be one that is in very high demand. They prefer to live on wide sandy beaches at lagoon mouths, sand dune areas, salt pans, and also the dried mud flats that are in wetlands. It's also important for them to have a consistent supply of kelp washing up on the beach. And it's also important that this kelp rack is not cleaned off the beach, as you sometimes see with beach grooming, which is a practice where basically tractors are used to rake up all of the kelp on a beach. And the reason that plovers rely on this constant supply of kelp washing up on shore is that they actually feed on the small invertebrates that live in the kelp rack. So they'll eat things like kelp flies and beach hoppers. And if you've ever been to Sands Beach, which is at Coal Point, you'll likely have noticed that we have no shortage of kelp rack or sandflies or beach hoppers. So there's plenty of food at the reserve for these guys to eat. Between October through February, snowy plovers are in their wintering season. And at this time of year, you can find them nestled in the sand in large groups numbering in the hundreds. We typically see about 200 plovers at Sands Beach during this time of year, during the winter. And they all kind of hang out in one area all together, just getting along really well. They spend their time feeding and a lot of time just resting and kind of re-upping their energy to get ready for the demanding nesting season that begins in March. Then once the nesting season starts in March, suddenly all the plovers that were super friendly to each other all winter long are starting to spread out and become very territorial of their space and their nests and their chicks. They nest directly on the beach in the sand in the spring and summer months. And once a mating pair has been established, the male will create several shallow scrapes in the sand by kind of pressing his chest into the sand and using his legs to kick out the sand behind him. So he'll make a few of these scrapes, generally in the same territory within, 5 to 10 feet of each other. And the female will then choose the scrape that she finds most suitable for laying her eggs. So she kind of picks a home for her future offspring. At that point, the pair will mate and the female will lay usually 3 eggs. The incubation period is about a month. And during this time, the male and female share the responsibility of incubating the nest so that the female typically sits on the nest all during the day, and then the male trades off with her and takes over at nighttime. And these plover parents are very dedicated to their nest, and it's actually pretty rare to see a nest without an adult actively sitting on it. They tend to spend all of their time when it's their turn sitting on the nest and not going too far. And as you can see in these top photos, sometimes they keep their nest very simple with just like a little shallow scrape in the sand and nothing else. And other times they may camouflage the nest with shells and other beach debris. And I've noticed this year they've been really into hiding their nest in vegetation, which makes it really difficult for me to find the nest, or a little harder, but it's also a really great protection from predators because it makes it really hard for the predators to see. So while this camouflage makes it hard for predators to find, predators can still key in on the scent or even see the parent sitting on the nest. And when that happens, the attending parent will use a technique called the broken wing display, where they basically distract the predator away from the nest by making a big show of pretending to be injured. So they'll kind of run around really low to the ground, dragging their wing and making a big drama that they're hurt. And at that point, they've usually distracted the predator away from the nest. And it's a pretty hard to miss behavior. So if you ever happen to see this when you're walking on the beach, just watch your step and kind of look around and give some distance, because this means that there's a nest or very young chicks nearby. So after about a month, the chicks hatch, and at this point, the female actually leaves the brood to go find another mate to nest with. And this strategy allows her to have several broods within one season. So meanwhile, it's actually the male plover that's responsible for raising the chicks as a single dad on his own for the next month. And plover chicks are about the cutest thing you can imagine. They have the look and size of a cotton ball on legs, and they are precocial, which means that they're actually capable of walking and foraging for their own food within just hours of hatching. And it's pretty amazing to watch. It's a cool juxtaposition because physically these chicks are so fragile. They look like they could just blow away with a big gust of wind. But then they have this innate strength and ability to forage for their own food when they're very young. And while the chicks can feed themselves, they still very much rely on their dad for survival in other ways. So the male plover is responsible for alarming the chicks of danger, keeping them warm, and also protecting their territory. And the chicks are very vulnerable for this very first month, as you can see how, how small they are. But they can't fly at this stage, and they also can't keep themselves warm. So it's really important that they're close enough to their parent to have constant access to protection and warmth. And this video shows that very sweet behavior of the chicks kind of snuggling up under the dad, either because something scared them or likely because they just want to warm up and feel safe. So after another month, the chicks fledge, and at this point they can fly, thermoregulate, and be completely independent of their parent. And by the following nesting season in the next year, they will be ready to join the breeding adult population to nest and raise the next generation of chicks. Western Snowy Plovers face many threats which have led to their threatened status. One of the most impactful is habitat loss, which is caused by a variety of factors from development, beach grooming, or the invasion of non-native species such as European beach grass, which can quickly invade and dominate a sandy beach ecosystem and thus make it unsuitable for plovers to nest. Predation is also a really big issue at all nesting sites. And while predation itself is obviously a very natural process, the problem is that urbanization has led to unnaturally high densities of predators that eat plovers and plover nests. And these predators include crows, skunks, and raccoons, which are all the same animals that you commonly see in urban areas going through our trash. So basically, this increase in the number of predators can lead to a significant loss of both nests and chicks. Inclement weather can affect nesting success because plovers nest in a very dynamic habitat on the beach. So high winds can completely bury nests, and high tides can also wash out nests. And lastly, human disturbance affects snowy plover behavior year-round, but keep in mind that their nesting season runs during the spring and summer months, which is the exact time that the beaches are most frequently used by us for recreation on the Pacific West Coast. So without some sort of protection, the effects of human disturbance can cause plovers to halt courtship behavior, abandon their nest, separate chicks from their parent, or even result in the accidental trampling of their very difficult to see nests. So to give you a bit of background on the recovery program at Coal Oil Point, plovers had historically nested at the reserve, but had stopped nesting for about 30 years. And this started around the late 1960s when this beach became more open to the public and more accessible. So in 1999, when we were seeing this range-wide decline in snowy plovers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually designated Sands Beach at the reserve as critical habitat. And in 2001, Coal Oil Point Reserve implemented the Snowy Plover Recovery Program and became the first site to successfully restore a plover nesting habitat that had previously been abandoned. And after 3 decades of no plover nesting at all, the first year of the program resulted in a breeding pair that successfully hatched 1 nest and fledged 1 chick. And because the reserve beach is open to the public, our conservation program consists of a balance between still allowing public recreation on the beach, but also having a protection program to reduce the impacts of those human disturbances. And the goal of the recovery program is to preserve the snowy plover habitat and also educate beach visitors about the plover natural history and conservation. And by doing this, we hope to create a positive connection with the community in which they value this type of environmental protection. So the first step in implementing this program was to conduct research to inform an optimal management model that balanced both plover protection and human recreation. And the studies found that without protection, plovers are disturbed every 27 to 43 minutes, which is 16 times higher than the disturbance rates that you see at protected beaches, such as those that are out at the Channel Islands. And through their research results, it became clear that simply setting aside some protected habitat in an area where the plovers could nest and reducing the human disturbance on those plovers could have a positive impact on the species. One aspect of the program was the addition of signage and rope fencing to designate the upper portion of the beach as protected. And you can see from this photo on the right how effective the symbolic fencing is. You know, everything outside of the fence is completely covered in human footprints. And then you look inside the fence and you have this amazing undisturbed beach habitat. So that sand looks like it hasn't been stepped on in a while. And this protective fencing reduces disturbance to the nesting behavior, and it also prevents the nests from being trampled. And a crucial component of the conservation program are the Snowy Plover docents who are at Sands Beach most daylight hours of every single day of the year. The docents educate beachgoers about plovers and also inform them of activities that could potentially disturb the breeding behavior, such as trespassing into the habitat or having a dog off leash. And they've done an excellent job of raising awareness, and after 20 years of outreach, you'd be hard pressed to meet someone visiting Sands Beach that had never heard of a snowy plover. We also employ some predator management strategies which focus on controlling problem predators in the nesting area. And we're frequently adapting depending on which animal is the predator of the year or the predator of the day, as it may be. So for example, over the last few years, we've had such intense predation by crows that we began using the predator exclosure cages pictured here to protect the nests until they hatched. And then partnerships with other sites and organizations enhance the reserve's capacity to achieve these goals and build support for the program. And just to give a few examples, our partnership with the Santa Barbara Audubon made it possible to start the recovery program in the first place. The Coastal Fund at UCSB supports supplies and paid internships for UCSB students. And our work with the zoo allows us to do captive rearing of plovers that otherwise would not survive. So to keep track of the status of the population, we survey the plovers weekly throughout the year with a monitoring emphasis during the nesting season. So during the nesting season, we typically go out 3 to 4 times a week for looking for new nests and marking their location. We check on the nests every couple of days, and if a nest does disappear, we will go out to see what happened to it. If the nest was predated, we'll search for animal tracks to determine what ate the nest. And if the eggs were buried by wind or washed out by tide, and the parent has abandoned those eggs, we'll actually collect them and put them in an incubator so that the zoo can raise them in captivity until they're old enough to release. So since the start of the recovery program, plovers have nested at Coal Oil Point Reserve every single year. And with time, it's become even more successful. And over the 20 years of the program, each year we've averaged 37 nesting adults, 64 nests, 75 hatched chicks, and 38 fledged chicks. So we've gone from 0 before 2001 to these amazing annual numbers that are really contributing to the bigger population of plovers out there. And on that note, I'll just leave you with a few ideas on what you can do to protect snowy plovers, including the opportunity to support our Gaucho Boost, which is this month-long fundraising campaign we're doing that supports plover conservation. And I believe Maury was going to put the link in the chat. So you can find that link to donate in the chat or on our website. And at this point, I will pass the baton on to Kipp to tell us about some restoration projects at the reserve.
Thank you, Jessica. And if you're interested, the link for the Gaucho Boost is in the chat.
Good evening, everyone. As Jessica and Maury already said, my name is Kipp Callahan. I'm the Land and Resource Steward at Coal Oil Point Reserve. I've been here for about 4 years, and this was my first sort of restoration-oriented job after graduate school. I had done some restoration work while working at Joshua Tree National Park and also with the Forest Service in Idaho before, but this was a really unique opportunity to be working on all parts of the restoration process. And so here at the reserve, or actually let's first, I want to define what is restoration, because it can mean different things to different people. And so for our purposes, ecological restoration is the act of recovering or renewing degraded and damaged ecosystems and habitats. And I think the key thing here is that for us, we're taking habitat that's been degraded from human activity, and we're not necessarily trying to recover it to its historic state, but to a state that we think meets our goals. And that's a really important thing to think about whenever we're thinking about restoration, because different restoration projects can have very different goals. The traditional restoration model that was often used by the Park Service, which is known as the Yosemite model, often aims to return habitat to its pre-European state, and they'll select a point in time that reflects that and try and bring that habitat back almost in time to reflect the composition of what it used to be. And there's other restoration projects that might try and achieve other goals, like there's been a lot of restoration projects with the specific goal of either carbon sequestration or water quality improvement or something like that. So one of the things that's always important when we're thinking about restoration is to define what our goals are. And here at the reserve, we want to reduce or eliminate the impacts from non-native species while fostering diverse natural communities that also support a wide array of species. And we want to protect and enhance habitat that supports rare or special species. And so the first thing is, why does the reserve need to be restored, and what brought us here? And the main thing is that over 100 years ago, after Europeans settled the area, the reserve went through a lot of changes in human land use. A huge proportion of the native vegetation was completely cleared off the reserve, which you can see in the photo on the left. The red outline is the reserve boundary, and you can see, and the slough is the brighter area on the right-hand side, and then to the left of that is where the upland is. And you can see it's this featureless, almost smooth-looking area, and that's because all the native vegetation had been cleared off of that. And you'll see kind of just behind the beach, a much darker, patchier network of shapes and colors, and that's what the native vegetation would look like. And so basically what happened is because the land was cleared, we went from what was likely something like the coastal scrub pictured in the upper right to something that looks more like what you see in the lower right, which is flat, invaded European grassland. And so the vegetation was cleared from the reserve for a variety of purposes. As many of you probably know, there was quite extensive oil development activities in the area, with the Elwood terminal being right near the reserve. There was also possibly some dry farming that was done at the reserve. Sweet potato, for example, is a crop that was common in Goleta. And then we also know that when the Campbell family purchased the reserve, that they were using it for some ranching as well. And so my background is in botany and plant ecology. And so my restoration take is very communities focused. And so the reason that's important is that really informs all of the decisions that I'm making, and is the underlying basis for the restoration that I've been doing since I've started at the reserve. And so here you can see a map of the reserve where this was done as part of one of our management plans several years ago. A consultant mapped the plant communities and natural communities at the reserve. So you can see there's actually quite a bit of diversity here. These communities I'll talk about a little bit later, but they were mapped with an older standard, and so we're actually now using some updated things, especially the Manual of California Vegetation has recently been published, and that is becoming the new standard for assessing habitats. And so rather than kind of go through an overall look at exactly what we do at the Reserve for Restoration and talk about methodologies and things like that, I want to use communities as the lens through which we look at the restoration activities at the reserve. And I want to do that because that's such a focus of how we do this. And so the first community that I want to look at is the Southern Foredune, also now known as dune mat community. And I think this is an especially apt community to look at first because it's so closely tied to the plovers. So the prime plover habitat is just towards the ocean from where most of this foredune and dune mat community occurs. But especially in some years like this year, for example, the plovers tend to nest a little bit farther off the open sand and into the dunes a little bit. And in that case, they're actually up here in this Southern Foredune community, which is just a little bit higher where the dunes are starting to pile up. And so back in the early days of the reserve, there were two main threats to this community. One was the invasive species. So as many of you guys know, Carpobrotus species, ice plants, are super common all over coastal California, and they're mat-forming species that was introduced for erosion control and dune stabilization, but have taken over large swaths of our coastal community. And it was no different at the reserve. While we did have some decent areas of intact dunes, there were also large areas that were starting to become covered in ice plant. There was also quite a bit of acacia, which is a mid-sized shrub that was growing in the transition area between the Bluff by Sands Beach and the dune area. And that had really started to have an impact on the dune habitat on that side. And then finally, especially in the 70s, with the increase in population in Goleta, there was a lot more beach use by humans. And it's the same thing that ended up having impacts on the plovers, also had impacts on the dune communities. And so just to get a sense of what this community looks like, Southern Foredune community is a community that's dominated by 3 species. The primary one is beach burr, Ambrosia camisonis. And this is a mat-forming species that will spread slowly out and can handle being partially buried by the sand. There's also beach evening primrose, which is Camisoniopsis taranthifolia, and sand verbena, which is Abronia umbellata, and both of those are also mat-forming species. And so what happens in these communities is the plants get established and they start to grow, and they can handle being partially buried by sand. And blowing sand in this environment actually gets caught up in the vegetation, and you actually start to form dunes once these plants get established. And so the reason that this is so important is that when there was lots of human use on the beach, people were trampling these plants, walking up in the dunes. And that was actually both flattening the dunes out and also by stepping on the plants, kind of breaking up the mats, it was preventing some of the dune formation. And once the symbolic fence was put in to help protect the plovers, it also did the double duty of helping to protect this Southern Foredune habitat because there were no longer people walking around in these areas. And we actually quite quickly saw the dunes start to grow up more than they had been before. We also started a program to remove all of the ice plant in the dunes on the reserve. So ice plant can also form these big mats, but they're really thick and there's not really any space in between them. You can see the picture of an ice plant mat up on the left side. And so they also take up a lot of water. They have these big elaborate root systems and they're able to suck up a lot of water, and all of those kind of green fingers you see hold quite a bit of water. So they're really competitive with the other dune plants out there, both in terms of taking up space, but also in terms of taking water. And so in order to restore the areas of the dunes that had been impacted from the ice plant, my predecessor did a lot of this work. And what we did is we took big sheets of black plastic and sandbags and actually covered all the big ice plant mats with black plastic, weighted it down with sandbags. And then what that allows to happen is solarization. So the sun will heat up the plants under the black plastic and basically kind of bake it in place. And then after several months to a year, we can come back, pull up the black plastic, and all of the underlying ice plant will be dead. And one of the things that makes this technique really interesting, especially in the context of our dune system, is that there's not a lot of soil disturbance. We're not using any chemicals. And because there was enough intact dunes and the ice plant hadn't been there for too long, there was actually quite a robust seed bank that still existed. And as a result, you can see what happens in this upper right-hand picture where there's poppies that are coming up on top of that dead ice plant. And we saw that result through most of our restoration areas where we didn't have to do very much outplanting at all. And once we removed the ice plant and we removed the acacia, the dunes came back from the existing seed bank and from nearby other plants. And then the final result of that is like what you see down here at the bottom, where you have a nice, diverse, robust mat of those 3 dominant species, along with a few other things mixed in. And so one of the things I thought was so neat about the way that this worked is that it was very small changes that were made in terms of changing human behavior and then removing this ice plant, and the community largely has been able to recover on its own. And then as part of this dune recovery and protection, we're able to provide habitat for several rare and unusual plants. So the one that I find most exciting is the coastal goosefoot, which is Chenopodium litorium. This is a CNPS 1B1 plant, which means it's rare, threatened, or endangered in California. And as of right now, Coal Oil Point Reserve is the southernmost extant population of this species. It mostly occurs north of Point Conception in the big major dune systems that we think of that are up there, like on Vandenberg or by Guadalupe, those kind of areas. And it probably once stretched all the way down to LA and maybe even into Orange County. There are some historic records from down there, but the development of these dune habitats and the way we use beaches as humans and the recreational things that we've done have largely eliminated the kind of open sandy habitat where this plant grows. This plant also has a really kind of interesting story because there was a lot of taxonomic confusion about it, and it was only described and known as its own taxa in the last 10 years. Before that, it was actually thought that it might be a non-native species from South America. So it's kind of cool that we have this Central Coast endemic that just grows in our dune systems. The other species that is of limited distribution that our restoration and especially the fencing helps protect is sticky sand verbena, which is Abronia marittima. And this is a mat-forming species that's very similar to the other Abronia umbellata, that's the dominant in this community. But this actually occurs right on the forefront of the dunes, kind of right on the edge of the habitat with the plovers, and I'm sure plovers often are nesting in or around this as well. And then finally, South Coast branching Phacelia occurs usually on the backside of the dunes. And it's currently a CMPS 3.2, which means more information is needed, but it's thought to be potentially threatened in California. And so by preserving the plover habitat and the dune habitat, we're able to preserve these extra rare plants as well. And so I thought this was a really nice example of where conservation that that was initiated to protect a rare threatened species with federal status actually enables the protection of these other rare species that don't have the same status. Okay, and then next I'd like to look at southern coastal bluff scrub or coastal sage scrub as another window into how we do restoration at the reserve. And I think this is a pretty different story from the dune mat restoration, because most of this kind of community and habitat was removed from the reserve. When we were looking at that aerial photo and saw those big open cleared spaces, those spaces likely had at least some coastal sage scrub on them. And so when we're starting to do restoration of those invaded grasslands, what we want to do is we want to look back at the past, but also at the present and into the future. And I think this is a really important thing to be considering when we're doing restoration. The historic way of doing it was to just look at the past and say, okay, what were things like back then, and try and model our restoration practices after that. But I think the more modern approach is acknowledging the past and looking at what things were in the past, but also looking at the present, trying to figure out what do we know about now, what is different about now, and then also looking into the future and thinking about what is the long-term trajectory of this place. And we now know more about how our environment and everything is a dynamic system, and so we need to take into consideration things like climate change, for example. So when I started the efforts into restoring coastal scrub and restoring these invaded degraded areas on the reserve, the first thing I did is looked back into the past. And so there are a few things that I did in this. One was to try and figure out what information existed from as far back as possible. So the first written records were produced by the Spanish. Mainly it was military men and religious men that were keeping journals. And those were almost all in Spanish, which makes it especially hard for someone like me who only speaks English to know what they were saying. But a lot of that stuff has been translated. And because the people writing the journals weren't botanists, there's been a lot of debate back and forth about what their descriptions mean. Because often, especially the explorers or the military men, would be talking about the vegetation in the context of forage for their horses. And they would use a few different words that are translated sometimes into grass, sometimes into shrub. And it's not clear, do they mean actual grasses when they say grass, like bunch grasses like stipa lepida or foothill needlegrass, or purple needlegrass, that one, foothill needlegrass, stipa lepida, or do they mean more herbaceous plants, forbs? And so one of the things that makes it really tricky is we actually don't have great records or a great idea of what the landscape was like before European settlement and before the major landscape level changes that happened with wide-scale grazing and the introduction of European invasive grass. However, we do have some pretty good records to look into the past from historic herbarium collections. So these don't stretch nearly as far back as Spanish settlement, but they do get us back sometimes as much as 100 years. And so these records come from botanists who were out here in California trying to catalog and understand what the plants were like. And they would actually collect a plant and dry it and press it. And then it gets stored in an herbarium in a museum. And now with the digital age, there's some really great tools that are available where we can query an area. So here you could see I drew a box around the reserve and pull all the records of herbarium specimens that occur at the reserve. And so this has been a really handy tool because we can compare species lists generated from these types of queries with the species lists we have now and see how they can compare. And we can look at some of the oldest records and see what those species are and how they might fit into what we know about existing plant communities now. And so this is a really handy place to start when we're trying to figure out what we want to restore the reserve to. And then we can also look at the present, and we can walk around in the place that we're going to restore, the areas we want to restore, and see what's left. And so here at the reserve, like I said, most of the vegetation was cleared, but there are still several areas where that have not been heavily invaded by non-native species, and where there are remnant stands of native species. So this picture, for example, is a stand of foothill needlegrass, which is Stipa lepida. And there's actually several stands like this in different parts of the reserve. So this suggests to us that at least at some point, this was probably a dominant or important species on the reserve. There are also several other places where there's California sagebrush, monkey flower, things like that. Lots of poison oak, coyote brush, things like that, that suggest that this area might have been a matrix of grassland and shrubland. And so once we get this idea that, okay, we're looking to potentially restore this area to a shrubland, a coastal scrub, how do we know what that should look like? And because I'm a very communities focused person, what I want to do is go out and find reference sites for areas that might not have faced the same kind of disturbance, but are still local, and collect data to see what did those communities look like, and use that to inform our restoration. And I think this is especially important because there's a lot of research and classification out there that catalogs plant communities, but it's often done either at a really large scale that doesn't give you fine enough detail to understand the regional variation, or it's done in one area and we're trying to make analogs between maybe sage scrub that's up in the Bay Area or down in San Diego with what we have here. So I think it's really important to find local reference sites and go and check those out. And this actually came as a surprise when we went and checked this reference site, which is at LCAP, and we did some data collection. When we looked at, when we were out there and we just looked at this stand that's pictured here on the left, we said, oh, this is coastal scrub. It's going to be dominated by a bunch of shrubs. It's going to have all this artemisia. And, when we looked at it, that made sense. But then when we actually started collecting the data, we came to understand that Stipa lepida, which is a bunch grass, was dominating the stand with the most cover and was actually down there under the shrubs in the understory. And so that really kind of changed our perspective about how we were going to do the restoration on the reserve. And we realized we needed to think about, these bunch grasses and potential understories for these shrubland communities. So once we have an idea of what we want our community to look like, then we start the process of getting prepared for the plants. So the first thing we need to do is collect seeds. And so when we do this, we really care about where the seeds come from. And that's because when we talk about a species, that's a circumscription of a bunch of plants, and populations that all share the same characteristics. But when we look at a species like poppies, for example, their distribution is actually super wide. It goes all the way across the whole state. And when we think about that, that means there's a ton of different climates, a ton of different soils that this species can exist in. But we have a specific climate and specific soils here at the reserve. And even though this is all one species, there's actually can be significant differences between populations from a genetics and also from an adaptation standpoint. And I think the poppies are a great example because we can see that even just between inland populations of the poppies and coastal populations. So the inland populations tend to be a deeper uniform orange, while our coastal populations tend to have a deep orange inside, but a yellow outer rim to their flowers. And that's a nice visual cue, but they also have several other adaptations that actually change their survival. So the coastal poppies often have some amount of mildew resistance, which makes them better adapted to the fog. And some populations also can be more prostrate, meaning laying down. And that makes them better adapted to high winds and things that we see along the coast. So when we do our seed collection, we get our seeds all within a few miles of the reserve if we can. Most of the seeds that we use are actually collected from remnant local populations on the reserve. Then we propagate our plants in our small greenhouse and nursery on site. And then finally, we do outplanting projects into the areas that we're trying to restore. And we have just a small staff, as Jessica said, it's just 3 of us full time. So we rely really heavily on student interns and seasonal and part-time staff to help us with these projects. We also draw a lot on the goodwill of student organizations. So clubs like the UCSB Wildlife Society and the Community Affairs Board, things like that, will often come out and help us with these activities. And so we can actually see here an example of where we're trying to restore one of these invaded grasslands to become a coastal scrub community. And this is kind of 2 different shots of areas that we're working on in different states. So the one in the upper left has plants that we planted this year and last year. And the one in the lower right is a few years older. So you can see over time, it's starting to transition to be more like that coastal scrub community we were aiming for. All right, thank you, everyone. Does anyone have questions?
Thank you, Jessica and Kipp, for your time and the wonderful presentation. Really great to learn about the history of the preserve and how much progress you guys have made in the last 30 years in regard to restoration and plover recovery. We all really appreciate your work. We'll open it up for Q&A now. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask Jessica and Kipp, now would be the time. There is a Q&A, should be a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can ask questions.
Hey, Maury.
Yes, Ken.
Well, people are thinking of questions. I'll just jump in. This is kind of low bandwidth here, so I'm not doing video tonight. But Coal Oil Point is one of the 2 jobs that I first took in restoration. So I was the reserve steward, and that was split between a little bit of funding that Christine had to pay me and what Audubon had through a grant. So I was working with Darlene Sherman, who of course worked on the preserve for a long time. And I had another job too, but the preserve meant so much to me, and it meant a lot, even more, I would say, to Duke McPherson, who co-founded CIR with me. He just started working on the trees for free out there for years, working with Chris when these were real early days. And, that got him really started in restoration. And then we met up on the islands, and the rest is history. And we came back. One of the first places that we did work on the mainland was at Coal Oil Point Reserve. So we've had staff, we've cutting down invasive trees on especially the back dunes. And I've been in there myself. I shouldn't say we have. I remember trying to figure out if I should cut if I had a native or a non-native tree in front of me. And, it was about 8 inches in girth. What is this? It was poison oak. And yeah, there is poison oak on those dunes. Sorry, I just had to throw in those personal stories. It really means a lot. You guys have done an amazing job. Chris Sandoval's an absolute hero. And the folks that work for university, I don't know. I don't know you folks personally. I do you, Kipp, but I don't think they pay you a whole hell of a lot. So these guys are really doing this kind of work, people who work for the reserve system are usually doing it because they really care, and it's special. Back to you, Maury.
Thanks, Ken. That was a great story. Okay, we have a couple questions in the chat now. Betty wants to know, have you ever partnered with biologists at VAFB? Not sure if either of you know what that is.
So at least for the snowy plover side of things, we do partner and collaborate with the groups at Vandenberg Air Force Base. There is a snowy plover population at the Air Force Base, and we meet with their biologists and other biologists across the range every year, and we communicate on email and Zoom meetings just to stay in touch and talk about what strategies are working, what issues we're having this year. And so there is a lot of collaboration between us and VAFB as well as the other sites. And Kipp can maybe talk more about whether he's worked with them for restoration work as well.
Yeah, we haven't partnered with them at all for restoration.
Okay, great, thank you. Jessica, perhaps another question for you. Kate wants to know, are there good ways for people to view the snowy plovers without disturbing their habitat? Which is a great question.
That's a great question. So luckily, Sands Beach at Coal Oil Point is a really unique place to observe snowy plovers in their natural habitat, and you can do so without disturbing them. So I would recommend, if you come down to the beach, to stay as close to the ocean as possible, like as close to the wet sand as you can be without getting wet. And bring a basic pair of binoculars, and you'll be able to see in between the ocean and just past the fence line. You'll see tons of plovers either nesting behind the fence, or they actually feed in that area between the fence and the ocean, because that's where all the kelp rack is. So it's actually fairly easy to observe them with the naked eye, or even better with some binoculars without actually impacting them or their behavior.
Great. Kipp, maybe you know the answer to this. Stephen wants to know, in history books he's read, there was an oak forest apparently in Goleta in the 19th century. Do you know if that habitat extended to Coal Oil Point Reserve and how dense it was? Do you know anything about that?
So yeah, so I mean, there's I think some pretty good evidence that that coast live oak, has had large stands and been an important species throughout Goleta, and there's still some remnant stands in different places around. I don't know for sure if we had compelling evidence one way or another whether there were any large oak stands at the reserve, but one of the initiatives that we have taken is to plant coast live oak at the reserve to try and connect almost like to create almost like a wildlife corridor between the Elwood open space and over towards Encos and that kind of thing. And so we have a few hundred oak trees that are on the northern part of the reserve, trying to restore some of that habitat. But it's hard to know for sure if that reflects a historic condition or not, but it's something we felt like moving forward in the future we wanted to have on the reserve.
Okay, great. And maybe a question for both of you. Do you observe any interdependence between the plovers, and the native plant species that are in their nesting and living zone?
So for the plovers, I mentioned kind of that they've especially recently been using that native dune vegetation more and more for hiding their nests. So they've definitely been dependent on those native plants that are in the dune system. And they also rely on having those dunes there. And in order to have the dunes, we need to have that vegetation to support that structure. And they rely on those dunes for protection from predators. It's something to hide behind. It's a little bit of a shelter almost. And definitely they use it for camouflaging.
Great. Someone else wants to know how the plover nesting season has gone this year as well.
So far, we're about halfway through the season, and it is going well. We've been using those predator exposure cages, so that solved the issue with crows eating the nests. And luckily, the crows haven't been back to eat the chicks. So currently we're at 18 fledged chicks. And like I mentioned, we're about halfway through the season, and our average number of fledged chick for a whole season is 38. So we're definitely on track to at least meet the average number of fledged chicks as long as everything continues on the right path.
Great. And Christy wants to know who are the main predators? Would it be crows?
The main predators of plovers?
I believe that's what she is asking, yes.
So the main predators at our site that eat the nests are crows and skunks. And then the main predators that eat the chicks are crows and hawks, and sometimes gulls. We will have occasionally a gull or two that will get a taste for the chicks. And then in terms of adults, they're predated on by hawks and falcons and all sorts of large birds.
Okay.
Oh, and also, yeah, coyotes and foxes can also have an impact. They have a lot of predators.
Thank you. Wayne Farron wants to let you know that great presentation and wonderful work. Not a question, but just a comment. Teresa has a question. Do you ever collect seeds and sow them? Not exactly sure.
I see that question. So it looks like she's asking if we sow them in situ, meaning on site. And so we actually don't usually do that because we have better success with germinating our seeds and then propagating them in the greenhouse so we can kind of take care of them to the best of our ability. And part of that is because we have such limited resources and staff and the scope of what we're doing is small, that we found that's how we get the best success. But I see it's in the context of not having a nursery. I do know that at North Campus Open Space, they drill seeded a bunch of Stipopulchra, which is purple needlegrass, and that worked really well. It's hard for me to know offhand whether that would be an effective tool to do on sort of a smaller scale if you were hand sowing seeds, just because the germination rates, even in pretty optimal conditions, can be somewhat variable and can be low. So I think you probably want to do more research to figure out if that's a viable option.
Gotcha. Thank you for fielding that question, Kipp. Betty wants to know if either of you are available for educating kids or students. Perhaps for her specific inquiry, she can contact you directly. But if you do any sort of, I know you do the docent program, do you ever work with school-age children or anything like that for environmental education at Colo Point?
Yes, we've occasionally worked with like elementary school kids. I've gone into classes at like Cappy Culver Elementary and Ivy Elementary to teach about, endangered and threatened species and what we can all do to help. So we definitely have that opportunity available if you want to reach out to us directly.
Okay, great. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat in the moment.
It did look like in the chat there was a question about whether there are opportunities for community members to volunteer at Colo Point.
Yes, you're right. I did not see that. Thank you, Kipp.
And that's a great question. So we have a few different opportunities. So the docent program, which Jessica talked about, community members are actually a really important component to that. And maybe Jessica can speak more to that after. And then also with the restoration program, we also rely pretty heavily on community volunteers, especially during the planting season. Right now, we mostly have students, but we'll also usually offer other kinds of public work days with Audubon Society or sometimes other community partners. And then anyone who wants to volunteer individually, especially during the growing season, the weed season, we're often in desperate need for help with planting or weeding. And so if you go to our website, my contact information is on there. You can reach out to me directly. And Jessica, do you want to speak to the docent program?
Yeah, I think you covered it. We're always accepting volunteers. The docent program runs year round. We protect the plovers during the nesting season and the wintering season to make sure that they can be happy and survive and do well before the nesting season. So we take volunteers at all times of the year. Feel free to reach out to me at my email address that's on the website.
Great. Thank you for summing that up. And I'm glad you caught that question, Kipp. So I think that's it for tonight. Thank you everyone for joining us. Next month, we will have Patrick Gonzalez, the principal climate change scientist from the U.S. National Park Service. I've also left a link in the chat to the CIR website if you're interested in more of our resources or becoming a member. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Kipp and Jessica. Thank you, Ken. And I will see all of you next month. Thanks.